In the video on the literary market, we have looked at the social and economic context, which gave sort of the breeding ground for this phenomenon of the rise that has been called the rise of the novel, this explosion in novel writing and novel publishing and novel reading. In this video, I want to take it more from a literary angle and introduce you to three novel writers and their most well-known works, and see how these three people who have been credited with birthing this new form of the novel that has then turned into the novel that we know today, how they shaped it in different ways, and together, if we sort of combine all of these influences together, we basically have the modern novel. So the first writer we want to take a look at is Daniel Defoe. Defoe certainly came from the emerging middle class. He is a prime exponent of the middle class. He was a businessman, actually, all of his life. He tried to get different business ventures to run. Many of his businesses failed, so he wasn't very successful. He was also a political pamphleteer, so one of those writers who wrote for a specific party and wrote polemical pieces for a political faction, and that actually brought him to the pillory. So he was sentenced for libel, and he had, as you see here on this image, he had to stand in the pillory. But then he had written in such a way that the people actually celebrated them, and instead of hitting him with I don't know, tomatoes and cabbages or even stones, they would throw flowers at him. He was a very prolific and very versatile writer. He wrote more than 500 books, if you can believe it, pamphlets, journals on various topics, including politics, crime, religion, marriage, psychology, and the supernatural. And only very late in his life, when he was about 60, he got into novel writing, or basically he invented the modern novel as it is with his novel Robinson Crusoe from 1719. So here are the first two pages of the original edition of Robinson Crusoe, and one thing you can see here is that the 18th century really liked long titles, so that the novel that you know as Robinson Crusoe really is the life and strange adventures of Robinson Crusoe, of York mariner who lived 8 and 20 years all alone in an uninhabited island, and so on and so forth. All of that is actually part of the title. The reason for these super long and super expressive titles is, of course, that there were no cover pages. So you couldn't have a fancy image or all of the marketing trappings that we have in books today. So basically everything, and also no back page cover where you could read about the text. So this is basically tells you everything that you need to know in order to know whether you want to buy the book. What there is on the opposite side of the title page, there's usually an image of the author. And the man you can see here on the left side, this isn't Daniel Defoe. This is, of course, Robinson Crusoe. And then if you look again at the title page, one thing that is missing, of course, is the name of the author. Instead, the title looks like it is actually the account of Robinson Crusoe. As you can see further down here, it's probably very difficult to read. It says here, written by himself. So the original edition gave the impression that this isn't a fictional text, but is a non-fictional account by Robinson Crusoe who actually existed, which of course wasn't true. And Defoe actually sort of went further in this game, in that he started the text not with Crusoe's account, but actually with an editor who had gotten these papers and publishes them to to the public, and he writes here, the editor believes the thing to be a just history of fact. Neither is there any appearance of fiction in it. And however things, because all such things are disputed, that the improvement of it, as well to the diversion as to the instruction of the reader, will be the same. And as such, he thinks, without farther compliment to the world, he does them a great service in the publication. So we have the fictional editor who doesn't exist, claiming that, you know, this is fact, this isn't made up. But even if it were, it would be just as entertaining and just as instructional. So we see of a double structure of legitimizing this enterprise by first claiming it's not fiction at all, but also it's good, it's didactic, right? It teaches you something, it will improve you morally. The question is, of course, why was fiction such a problem at this point, and for Defoe? Why not just admit, well, this is a made-up story? I mean, this isn't the first time that a fictional story had been published, but in a way, it is the first time in prose narrative that a fictional story dealt with reality, dealt with something that wasn't recognizably fictional, but that was just extremely contemporaneous, very close to reality, and it described things in a way that were meant to make them appear real, and that really is the birth of literary realism. Now, realism, of course, in this sense, is not fact versus fiction, but rather a specific way of describing the reality that you're fictionalizing. So it's very much more about the reference, how you reference things, that you, for example, do not put your story in some kind of in the past or in a distant country or in an unnamed country, but rather that you make use of concrete times and place names, and use of the present and of the immediate past. And also the detail, the fact that you really pay attention to all the details that make it realistic, right? That's the point. So the story, of course, I mean, everyone knows the story of Robinson Crusoe. The story is that Robinson Crusoe gets shipwrecked, and then he's alone, and he spends some 28 years on an island all alone. So basically the story is Crusoe survived alone on an island for 28 years. But realism asks, well, how did he do that? How exactly? I mean, what did he eat? Where did he sleep? Did he have tools? Which tools? What did he do with them? And all of that. And this is really what we get in Robinson Crusoe, the novel. We get an incredible detail to the how. In a romance, this would have been an episode that would have been over in a paragraph. But here we get hundreds of pages that give us all of the details. And this has been sometimes called circumstantial realism, because it looks at the specifics of all of the circumstances. And of course, what we can see here is the impact of empiricism, of this philosophy of knowing that bases everything on concrete observation and the concretely given, and that's what we need to focus on that which is actually there. So really the tools, I mean, Defoe spends a lot of time talking about he finds a box of tools from the ship, and that is kind of the foundation of everything that he does, and he describes these tools and what he does with them. And finally, of course, realism is a specific way to engage probability. So it works against the improbability that was a hallmark of romance fiction, where the wildest coincidences would usually occur. And it also means that narrative is concerned with that which is most probable also in social terms. So it is an affair of the middle class, of that of these sort of stories that are normal in a probable way. But of course, also it contains that ambivalence that this is, after all, a very, very improbable story. How can someone survive for 28 years alone on an island? So that's what makes it interesting, that you get this highly improbable story that is yet related in such a a way that makes it as probable as possible and as understandable as possible. So we see here in Robinson Crusoe the emergence of realist fiction, the emergence of realism in narrative. And we could formulate a thesis that would say that the realist novel's concern with the daily life of ordinary people is really the result of the emergence of individualism. Individualism meaning that each person is distinct and is valuable for its distinctness. And if that is true, then we can say that this individualism has itself two sources that are important for the novel. The first source is Protestantism, especially in its Calvinist and in its Puritan form, because Protestantism abolishes the mediators, the spiritual mediators between man and God. This was the thing that changed from Protestantism to Catholicism, that you don't have this hierarchy of intermediates. If you want to talk to God, you can actually do that yourself in a way through internalization, because of that, because you don't go to confession, you don't have someone to confess to, it introduces the necessity of self-scrutiny, of self-investigation. You have to look inside your own and ask yourself whether you've done good or not. And that brings with it methods of self-scrutiny like journals, confessionals, or autobiography. And when we secularize these, that becomes an interest in psychology. And we find that in Robinson Crusoe, and that he actually starts to write a journal, and a large part of the novel is the journal that Robinson wrote on the island as a way to account for his own being and for his own behavior. And the other source of individualism we could see in capitalism, in modern, later industrial capitalism, because that brings with it specialization, economic specialization, differentiation. People start becoming more and more specialized and diverging more and more, so that you don't know what most of the people in your own country actually do, which means that it becomes interesting to learn about that. It becomes interesting to see what a merchant does, or what someone that goes to sea does, and so on. So we have this differentiation. Then capitalism, of course, brings with it a larger social mobility, the ability to move upwards in the social ladder, which brings a larger emphasis on individual choice. We already saw that emerge on the early modern stage, this question of how and what should I be, and that means that individual decisions become more interesting. And thus, Crusoe really becomes the exemplary Homo economicus, in that he is sort of this almost like a petri dish for this type of religiously inspired capitalism, in that he comes to this island and then creates his own world on this island. And as I said, the foundation for this really is the middle class. Crusoe is determinedly middle class. His father spells it out for him at the beginning, when the father bade me observe it, and I should always find that the calamities of life were shared among the upper and lower part of mankind, but that the middle station had the fewest disasters. So you don't want to be poor, obviously, but you also don't want to be up there at the top, because that's where bad things happen as well. So it's nice. The nicest thing is to sort of stay the course and stay in the middle. Here's the middle, and live a nice and sheltered life. Of course, Crusoe disregards that completely at the beginning and says, no, I want to adventure. I want to go to sea. I want to become rich. And then he gets shipwrecked. And comes to the realization at the end that yes, that would have actually been the best thing to sort of stay in the middle. In addition, Robinson Crusoe is also filled with religious aspects. Defoe himself was a Puritan moralist. He normally worked in the guide tradition. As I said, he started novel writing, fiction writing late. He was more into writing books on how to be a good Puritan Christian, books such as The New Family Instructor or Religious Courtship. And while Robinson Crusoe is far more than a guide, it does share many of the themes and theological and moral points of view of these conduct books. The book tells the story of how Robinson became closer to God, not through listening to sermons in a church, because there is no church, there is no priest, there is nobody to tell him anything, but through spending time alone amongst nature with only a Bible to read. That's very important, that he has the Bible. That is sort of, because that again is sort of the spirit of Protestantism, that the only thing that you need is the Bible. Sola Scriptura, says Martin Luther, and says this is all you need. You need to read the Bible. This is what Crusoe does. So it's a story. It becomes a story of providence, penitence, and redemption as well. Crusoe comes to repent of the follies of his youth, and he learns to pray to God first by randomly opening his Bible. This was sort of an exercise that people did. You just open the Bible at any point, read it, and then see whether that tells you something about your current situation and gives you inspiration. Crusoe often feels guided by a divinely ordained fate, thus explaining his optimism, his robust optimism in the face of apparent hopelessness. His various fortunate intuitions are taken as evidence of a benign spirit. So he actually comes to see that God sustains him on this island, and that it is only once he has sort of gone through that phase and recognized that he can actually be delivered from the island and can be saved from the island. Robinson Crusoe has been widely read in different ways as an allegory for the development of civilization, as a manifesto of economic individualism, but also as an expression of European colonial desires. There's so many readings of it. There's also, of course, like with Gulliver's Travels, so many adaptations that the original really has pretty much been lost to most people who would know Robinson Crusoe without knowing the original source text, but it is definitely worth going back to the original source text. It's a surprisingly good read as well. So check it out. Check out The Birth of Realist Fiction with Daniel Defoe's work, Robinson Crusoe, or any of his other novels that he wrote after Robinson Crusoe. The next writer that I want to introduce is Samuel Richardson. Like Defoe, Richardson also came to novel writing relatively late in life. He only started writing fiction at the age of 50, and of course we have to think in terms of a very different expected lifespan. So 50 was pretty advanced in age. Richardson was actually a successful printer up to that time, so he was involved in the book trade, but as a publisher and as a printer. Also, Richardson conceived of his work as instructional, similar to Defoe. There was to be an instructional purpose to novel writing and novel reading. So this wasn't something that you do merely for entertainment, but also for instruction. We can look, for example, here at this. This is supposedly an image of Richardson reading from his novel to this congregation of people. So we can see that this is also sort of almost like a public act, this novel reading, and that these people expect to be both entertained and instructed by it. And as we can see here in the preface, Richardson also stresses the difference of this kind of writing and how that is of a more serious instructional bent than the previous type of novels, which would be called romance at the time. So he says this about his first novel, Pamela. Pamela might introduce a new species of writing that might possibly turn young people into a course of reading different from the pomp and parade of romance writing, and dismissing the improbable and marvelous with which novels generally abound, might tend to promote the cause of religion and virtue. So again, we see this attack on the improbable of the Romans writing, but also on the possible immorality. And here, in contrast, we have high moral tale. We can already see this in the full title. Again, here you have a very long title, but at least sort of the full main title is Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. So it makes very clear that this is a story, this is a moral tale about how virtue will be rewarded. And early stories of about the reading of Pamela really emphasize this gripping and instructional and emotional impact of the story. Pamela tells the story of a beautiful young girl, Pamela Andrews, a 15-year-old maidservant whose noble master, Mr. B, just comes in here into the door, makes unwanted advances towards her after the death of his mother, whose maid Pamela had been since the age of 12. Mr. B is infatuated with her, first merely by her looks, and then increasingly also by her innocence and her intelligence. But of course, his high rank hinders him from proposing marriage. So he abducts her, he locks her up in one of his estates, he continues to try to seduce her, and at one point even attempts to rape her. She rejects him continuously through all this time. So all the time she keeps him at bay. But she comes to gradually realize that she is actually falling in love with him. And all this while she writes letters, letters to her parents, which of course from the moment on when she's been abducted, she can't send out any letters anymore, but she keeps writing them. So at one point Mr. B intercepts the letters to her parents, and reading them makes him realize more about Pamela's internal life, and he becomes even more enamored by her innocence and intelligence and her continuous escape attempts. So finally her virtue is then eventually rewarded when he sincerely proposes an equitable marriage to her, and they're actually getting married. And in the novel's second part, Pamela attempts to build a successful relationship with him and to get used to the new society that she is now a part of. As I already said, Pamela writes letters, and this is what we get to read. What Richardson pioneered here is the form that we have called the epistolary novel. So a novel that more or less completely consists of novels, and in this case it's actually just novels by this one person, more or less. The major part is novels by Pamela to her parents, and that, of course, brings with it certain differences in narration. Richardson called this technique and the effect that it has writing to the moment. So writing to the moment means that you do not write the story after it has already happened, or you do not narrate the story after it has already happened, which is the norm. We usually narrate stories in the past as something that has already happened, which means that you already know everything about the story when you're the narrator. For example, someone telling their life story. They know how it ends up to the point of the present. Whereas here we have these shorter passages that then continue on. So he describes this method of writing in this way. Much more lively and affecting must be the style of those who write in the height of a present distress, the mind tortured by the pangs of uncertainty, than the dry narrative, unanimated style of a person relating difficulties and dangers surmounted can be. The relator perfectly at ease, and if himself unmoved by his own story, not likely greatly to affect the reader. So here we have someone who is still in the moment, where the events are still unfolding. So as Pamela is writing, she of course doesn't know how the story is going to end. She doesn't even know how the day is going to end. So she writes a novel, she writes a letter about, let's say, the what has happened on the day, and then she has to break it off because someone comes in, and then she continues writing later on what happened from that point on. And this is the sort of writing to the moment. You have sort of continuous story arches that go on, but all the time the narrator doesn't know how it's going to end and is therefore extremely involved, and has this sort of very, very close perspective on what's happening, and not a detached perspective of someone who tells us from a point in time that is far removed. And this is one of the effects of the novel, that we're getting so close to Pamela and her mind and her fears and anxieties, that it really it makes us empathize so extremely with that character. In later novels, Richardson will sort of make this a little bit more complex by having several letter writers writing letters to each other, and we get several perspectives. But here we're exclusively focused on Pamela and her mind. But of course, already here in this game, in this novel, there is sort of a complex game going on of writing and reading in interrelation, and that is also part of the moral message, but also a complication of the moral message. Here you see an illustration, a contemporary illustration, from the moment that Mr. B has intercepted her letters and is actually reading her letters. So the novels originated in an attempt actually to write not a novel but a conduct book. This was something that Richardson had published. This was a very popular genre all throughout the 18th century. Books that attempt to educate the reader on social norms. You can see here an example, The Young Lady's Conduct or Rules for Education, where you see sort of instruction in how to live a good life. And you can see here also that, for example, of course, temperance, chastity, industry, and so on are important aspects. So this was what Richardson set out to write, and then he sort of had the idea, well, to make it a little bit more entertaining, I'm going to write this in the form of letters from a young servant girl who writes back to her parents, and out of that really the novel grew. But we see how it is rooted in this moral instruction, really. Now, Richardson strongly believed in the novel's ability of moral instruction, but his model already contained an inherent contradiction. The novel claims that virtue and modesty and chastity are above all, and yet it derives its fascination from the depiction of the seduction, at least the possible seduction. This is one of the things that keeps us reading, that we're interested in this. And just as Mr. B is turned on by Pamela's innocence and purity, so we have to admit is the reader. And in fact, the epistolary form brings us maybe closer to the heroine than might seem decent. After all, this is a really, really private conversation, communication that she engages in. She writes to her parents, the only ones where she can lays her heart open, and she doesn't write to us. This isn't written as a novel, but this is what we read. So the proximity that is one of the strengths of the novel is, of course, also in a way one of its moral problems, because the reader becomes almost like a peeping tom in the same way that Mr. B does, and this is why this is such a crucial scene here, that Mr. B takes away her writing, her private writing, which she actually hides in her dress. So the book the text makes it very clear how closely aligned her writing, and even her body is. And he pries us away from her and reads it just like we did. We have done the same thing. So we are in a way echoing this peeping tom action, which is why the novel has been sometimes called a sermon and a striptease. In fact, there was immediately a lot of criticism against the type of morality that that is represented, and the hypocrisy in this sort of doubling of the voyeur. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this parody specifically, but the quote fits in here at this point. This is someone describing the act of reading Pamela, and he says, "Oh, if I lay the book down, it comes after me. When it has dwelt all day along upon the ear, it takes possession all night of the fancy. It hath witchcraft in every page of it. Oh, I feel an emotion even while I am relating this. Methinks I see Pamela at this instant with all the pride of ornament cast off." So this tells us a little bit how the contemporaries judged of the reactions to this text. So and readers did become at least unconsciously aware of the paradox of the reward system. Remember, the subtitle is "Virtue Rewarded," because the novel's morality claims that virtue will be rewarded, and this is explained, of course, in religious terms. If you are being virtuous, then God will reward you. But it is presented in worldly terms. In the end, she is being rewarded by marriage. This is what she gets. Though not in intent, in effect, this brings the situation dangerously close to an economic system, because we could just say Pamela restricts the supply of herself until the demand is high enough that she can get the right price for her chastity, which is repeatedly referred to as a jewel in the novel. And in fact, the price continuously rises. First of all, Mr. B just gives her some presents and tries to seduce her that way. Then he promises money. Then he promises to her to be a kept mistress, which means that he basically pays for her life, gives her a house and money to live on for the rest of her life, so that she remains his mistress. And then, but she continues to hold off until she gets what maybe she wants, and that is the marriage. This in part, of course, reflects the marriage market all the way into the 20th century. This was the way that the marriage market works, but of course not across these social boundaries. That was a step too high. So this is basically a fairy tale story of social contrast that is overcome. And in this sense is, of course, a crass misrepresentation. This doesn't happen in reality. So people also felt that it encourages the wrong ideas and dreams. But nevertheless, it was hugely successful. Pamela was really read all across the country. It's also one of the first documented cases of merchandise that is not a sort of an adaptation, but rather objects that are being associated with Pamela. Here you can see an advertisement for a fan, right? Something to fan air. This day is published for the entertainment of the ladies, more especially those who have the book Pamela, a new fan representing the principal adventures of her life in servitude, love, and marriage, designed and engraven by the best masters, and so on and so forth. So there were objects that were illustrated with scenes from Pamela that could be bought. But of course, not all of the reactions were so congratulatory. Some of them were satires, parodies, attacks, but also adaptations and continuations. So immediately after the publication of Pamela, Fielding's Shamela came out, then there was another attack, Pamela Censored, but also Pamela's Conduct in High Life, which is already here a few months later an attempt at writing a sequel to the text. Eliza Haywood's Anti-Pamela, James Parry's The True Anti-Pamela, and then the second volume, actually, just so May was the first volume of Pamela's Conduct in High Life, and then comes the second volume of Pamela's Conduct in High Life, not written by Richardson. This isn't his own sequel. Someone else writes that. And then in November we have the first adaptation, stage adaptation, Pamela, a comedy, The Virgin in Eden, Memoirs of the Life of Lady H, the celebrated Pamela, another unlicensed continuation. And then in December, Richardson writes his own authorized continuation, Pamela in Her Exalted Condition, as a sequel to his own book. Then another biography of Pamela, and then Fielding continues his attack on Richardson with Joseph Andrews, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in detail. And that brings us to the final author of this video, and that is Henry Fielding. Like Defoe and Richardson, Fielding did not start his literary career as a novelist. He was, amongst other things, the most prolific and the most popular dramatist of the 1730s. So he really became known in the literary world as a writer of plays, satirical plays, farces that were written expressly against the government, that actually caused Parliament to pass a law to shut down his theatre. So at this point, I'm going to make, before we get into Fielding as a novel writer, we're just going to make a brief excursion into the theatre. The 1720s, after the initial success of the sentimental comedy that came after the Restoration comedy, the 1720s and 30s saw a rise in political satirical plays, and they were mainly directed against the government, against corruption in the government, and particularly at one person, and this person was Robert Walpole, whom you see here. And Walpole was a minister of the government, and he basically is the creator, inventor of the position of the prime minister, because of the eminence that he gained. He actually had the longest tenure as minister in English history. But he also had a strong opposition and accusations of corruption. As the longer his tenure went on, the more people felt that his government was fundamentally corrupt. And Fielding was amongst the most aggressive attackers of this corruption. But the most successful and the most lasting contribution in this regard, and this is sort of where where I insert a different text and a different author's text here into this, the most lasting testament of this satirical drama against the government is John Gay's The Beggar's Opera from 1728. The Beggar's Opera premiered then and ran for 62 consecutive performances, which doesn't sound too much, but it was the longest continuous run in theater history up to that time. So it was a huge success on the stage immediately. The form that it takes is that of a ballad opera, and a ballad opera, those were usually satirical plays that used some of the conventions of the opera. They had music, they had singing, but without the part where the normal dialogue would be sung as well. So it's basically like today's musicals, in that you would have sort of a normal stage play, and then in between you have musical numbers, and they were not composed for this play, but rather Gay used popular ballads, hymns, tunes from popular operas for this, and gave them new lyrics that fit the story. So the audience would already recognize and already like these songs. So that's certainly one thing that helped its popularity. The story is set in London's underworld amongst the thieves, but also the thief catchers, and it is full of these corrupt figures that could be understood as easy allusions to Walpole and his government. So it's a very thinly veiled attack on the where this underworld of criminals is basically mirroring the upper world of the government. It was adapted exactly 200 years later into another play by Bertolt Brecht with music by Kurt Weill, the Drei-Groschen-Oper. This is probably a text that you're familiar with, and that's very closely aligned. It's basically a reworking of the Beggar's Opera. And these plays, these continuing attacks actually brought as a counter-reaction by the government the Theatrical Licensing Act of 1737. So you might remember that I said that after the lapse of the Licensing Act of 1695, there was no censorship in publication in England, and the same applied for the drama. But here suddenly there is a law that says that from this point forward, the Lord Chamberlain had the power to approve any play before it was staged. So before you could put something on the stage, you have to hand in the text to the Lord Chamberlain, and he will look and say, yeah, you can stage that, or no, you can't. So that was a very effective way of censoring the stage, and that basically meant that Fielding was out of a job. He was forced out of the theater, and he was forced to write differently. And drama returned to the domestic and to the sentimental topics, as well as the melodrama that had ruled earlier. But also it meant that the novel gained ground as the most important and most attractive option for authors. So for a while, Fielding practiced the law for a living. He was also working as a judge, and he continued to write satires and essays. But then in 1741, Samuel Richardson's Pamela was published and became a huge success. And along with others, Richardson wasn't happy with the book. He thought it was crude, pretentious in writing, and pernicious in this mercenary morality that it so piously inculcated. That Providence would be rewarded with pounds and social position, that is something that he saw as problematic. So in April 1741, he wrote the first of the so-called anti-Pamelas, an apology for the life of Mrs. Shamela Andrews, a devastating travesty of Richardson's novels, the essence of which is hilariously distilled into a few pages. This is a very, very short work, just a few pages that make fun of the morality, but also make fun of the style of writing, the writing to the moment style, which he exaggerates to an extreme. Even already in Richardson, of course, the writing to the moment was not really realistic. Someone has calculated that Pamela it would not even have all the time to write what she has lived, for her to live these experiences. She would have to spend all time in writing, and there's very often that she says, "Oh, I have to stop writing because someone is coming in the door. Who can that be? I'm just going to open the door," and then we have a dash, and then the story continues. So already there, it was a little bit of a convention that she can do this, and Fielding makes fun of this. So this is from Shamela, where he parodies the situation where Pamela is in bed with the housekeeper, and then Mr. B comes in and tries to seduce her. So this is Shamela writing. Mrs. Jervis and I are just in bed, and the door unlocked. If my master should come, odds bobs, I hear him just coming in at the door. You see, I write in the present tense, as Parson William says. Well, he is in bed between us, we both shamming asleep. He steals his hand into my bosom, which I, as if in my sleep, press close to me with mine, and then pretend to awake. I no sooner see him, but I scream out to Mrs. Jervis. She feigns likewise, but just to come to herself, we both begin, she to be called, and I to be scratched very liberally. So she's and supposedly she's writing all of this down as she's doing, because she is writing in the present tense. Now, Fielding could have left it at that, but he still wasn't finished with Pamela. So he continued to write another book, and that turned in the next year into this novel, The History of the Adventures of Joseph Andrews and of his friend Mr. Abram Adams, and that is also based on the success of Pamela, because it tells the story of her brother, but that completely outgrew its original purpose. So here in writing against Richardson, Fielding suddenly, just like Richardson sort of in writing a conduct book develops a novel, here in writing a parody and a critique of one novel, Fielding starts to write his own novel, and he becomes interested in the characters way beyond their purpose as a foil to Fielding's Pamela. So in this it is the splendid realization of a theory of fiction also that is diametrically opposed to Richardson. So we saw already in Pamela how he makes fun of the style of writing, but here in an even more broad sense he tries to create a theory of fiction that is very different from Richardson's. Fielding declared his allegiance very boldly in the title page. You can see this here, that the story is written in imitation of the manner of Cervantes, author of Don Quixote. So this was sort of the model on which he would base his own text. And in his famous preface, which is itself an important document in the history of criticism, and in the introductory chapter to Book 3 of the narrative, Fielding attempted to define the kind of work that he had written. Fielding called Joseph Andrews a comic epic poem in prose. So he didn't want to call it a novel, but he also didn't want to call it a romance, but it's a comic epic poem in prose, or alternatively a special form of history or of biography that is truer than the works usually associated with those terms, because its subject was timeless and universal. So in this sense, Fielding is sort of in between realism and neoclassicism. Like its great model, Don Quixote, then, though set firmly in the England of George II, Joseph Andrews would be, as he says himself, the history of the world in general. In relating that history, Fielding meant to represent nothing less than the essential and unchanging truth of the human comedy. As he says, I describe not men, but manners, not an individual, but a species. Such a conception of the way in which an artist imitates what really exists places Fielding, of course, squarely in the tradition of neoclassicism. And here we're going to make another detour to a novel that I have already mentioned briefly when we talked about Samuel Johnson. His only novel, Rasselas, which is a philosophical novel, but also a novel that talks a lot about literature. Johnson, after all, was a literary critic. And in Rasselas, there is this debate about the representation of reality, and this famous passage spoken by one of the characters here. The business of a poet, said Imlac, is to examine not the individual, but the species, to remark general properties and large appearances. He does not number the streaks of the tulip, or describe the different shades of the verdure of the forest. He is to exhibit in his portraits of nature such prominent and striking features as recall the original to every mind, and must neglect the minuter discriminations. So not, in other words, to offer what we would call maybe photographic images of individual objects in real life, which will invariably be different from each other, deviating from the general type, but rather to represent the truly essential qualities that define the species in general, the nature, as it were, of tulipness. So this is sort of the neoclassical vision. You have to don't number the streaks of the tulip, but give me tulipness in its essence. And this is rather the aesthetic that Fielding strove as well for. So what we can identify here are basically two different rivaling concepts of the novel. First, we have novelists like Defoe or Richardson, and their attempt to create an illusion, a counterfeit of actuality, by using the techniques that we have called circumstantial realism, to produce narratives full of particulars in which every streak of the tulip is actually numbered. And in contrast, writers like Fielding or Joseph Johnson give their readers only those few particulars which, though of course helping the reader to visualize a character, function primarily to reveal the values that define the character's true nature. So to give sort of an idealized and universal image of that. Implicit, of course, in these opposing theories of fiction is the distinction between classical and modern worldviews as well. The circumstantial manner in which Defoe and Richardson go about imitating what really exists is part and parcel of the new empirical sense of reality to which the scientists of the Royal Society subscribed, whose approach to truth was through amassing, weighing, and measuring particulars. Fielding, however, like his contemporaries Swift and Pope as well, remained loyal to the old values of the Christian humanist tradition, which the Baconian empiricism was gradually displacing. And in this tradition, the highest reality transcends the realm of shifting particulars in which life is actually lived. It is found instead in the essential form of things and in generalized types in the species, not in the individual. So Joseph Andrews was the novel in which Fielding developed started to develop this theory of fiction and of novel writing. But the consummation of his craft as a novel writer is certainly Tom Jones, the novel from 1749. This is sort of his masterpiece and the embodiment of neoclassical Enlightenment notions. Announced in the opening chapter, the subject of Tom Jones is nothing less than human nature. Not only the passions and foibles, virtues and vices shared by men and women of every social class, but the characteristics of society itself in all its ranks and degrees. Fielding captured the entire panorama of mid-Georgian England. This really gives you a sweeping panoramic view of society. But he means his book to transcend the particulars of time and place by implying universal matters. His story may be read not only as an accurate imitation, but also as an interpretation of life. And this is one of the differences, that he just, not like an empiricist, just gives us the facts and the details and lets us judge for ourselves, but rather provides the judging in mainly in his narrative voice. So the novel becomes an imitation and an interpretation of life, and it becomes the consummate expression of the ethos of England's Augustan age. Fielding meant Tom Jones as a model or a paradigm of the Christian humanist worldview, the embodiment in narrative form of the optimistic worldview that was set forth by people like Alexander Pope in an essay on man, with this notion that all partial evil is universal good and that all chance is direction that we haven't understood yet. And he tries to create a notion of that through his the structure of his very narrative. So some of the core structural features are expressions of his theme, the symmetrical design of the novel, the unfolding of its plot through the probable interaction of the characters and through highly improbable coincidences. Sometimes they are apparently unlucky in the extreme, but eventually they prove to be very fortunate indeed, and most importantly, of course, in its famous omniscient author. So this, not an author, but narrator. So the idea that the narrator is this all-knowing stand-in almost for godlike position that is able to see these connections that we might miss for the moment. And this is where we get sort of the interpretation of the facts that we are being given. So Fielding, in a way, is to his own great creation as the deity is to his. He creates basically a model world in which he, as narrator, can act as a god and becomes sort of a stand-in for the guarantee that God is there and structures our universe as well, and that everything in the end will turn out fine. So this is in a way the high point of fiction's self-confidence in saying yes, fiction can explain the world to you. So now we can sum up what these three writers and their novel writing brings to the development of the novel as what we might call the legacy of realist narrative fiction. So first of all, we have observation and description of things as they really are. This objective, neutral mode that doesn't deem anything not worthy of representation, but rather really wants to look at all the circumstances, and that would be Defoe and empiricism, if you will. Then we have the mediation of the emotional experience of someone else, that we can feel or be made to understand what someone else feels, and this is what Richardson brings us, the notion of empathy, that we can empathize with characters, actually feel for these characters. And then finally, the use of narrative mediation to explain, to interpret, and to evaluate, which Fielding brings with it, with a rationalist mindset. And basically, if you take these three elements, you can make different mixtures of them and create all of the novels that follow afterwards.